Miss Dorothy Fenwick had been called many things in 24 years, and plainest girl in the county had followed her with such persistence that she had stopped flinching at it sometime around her 17th birthday. She stood now at the edge of the Ravensworth ballroom, watching her three sisters move through the crowd like a small, glittering fleet of ships, and adjusted her shawl over a gown that had been remade twice and still showed it. "You look perfectly well," her sister Sophia said, not unkindly, fixing an errant curl in the mirror beside her. "You always say that as though it were a tragedy, and it simply isn't." "I'm not saying anything," Dorothy said. "I'm standing here, which is what I generally do at these things. You could dance." "I could," Dorothy agreed. "No one has asked." This was not entirely true. Mr. Hollis had asked the previous month, and Dorothy had declined because Mr. Hollis smelled persistently of damp wool and discussed nothing beyond the price of mutton. She had decided some years ago that she would rather be overlooked than bored, and so far the strategy had served her admirably. "Mother says the Duke's ball is meant to be the event of the season," Sophia continued. "She is hoping Isabel catches his eye, or Clara. She has not entirely decided which." "She has not considered me at all, I imagine." "You know how Mother is," Sophia said, which was, Dorothy reflected, not actually a denial. She did not mind it. She had decided this a long time ago, the way one decides to live with a draft in an old house. Not happily, but practically, because the alternative was spending one's whole life cold and resentful over something unlikely to change. The Duke of Ravensworth entered his own ballroom an hour into the proceedings, which Dorothy noted with some amusement was precisely the sort of lateness only a duke could manage without consequence. He was tall, dark-haired, with an expression of composed reserve that several mothers nearby were already attempting to dismantle through strategic positioning of their daughters. Dorothy watched the maneuvering with the detached interest of someone who had never once been included in it. "He is looking this way," whispered her sister Clara, fanning herself with sudden vigor. "He is looking at the orchestra," Dorothy said. "They've been flat all evening." "He is definitely looking this way." He was, in fact, looking their way, though Dorothy assumed this was simply the natural consequence of three remarkably handsome sisters standing together in a single cluster of silken curls. She did not include herself in the assessment. She had stopped doing that years ago. The Duke crossed the room with unhurried purpose, and Dorothy watched her mother straighten beside her with the particular electricity of a woman sensing opportunity. He stopped directly in front of Dorothy. "Miss Fenwick," he said. There was a brief, profound silence, during which Dorothy became aware that her mother had stopped breathing entirely. "Your Grace," Dorothy said carefully, "I believe you have mistaken me for one of my sisters." "I have not," he said. "I asked specifically for you. Would you do me the honor of the supper dance?" The supper dance lasted considerably longer than the music required, because by its end the entire ballroom had stopped pretending not to watch. "You danced rather well," the Duke observed as the music ended. "I danced adequately," Dorothy corrected. "I am aware of the difference, Your Grace, and I would rather not be flattered unnecessarily." "That is a curious request." "It is a practical one," Dorothy said. "I have spent 24 years watching people flatter my sisters and overlook me entirely, and I have found I prefer honesty considerably more than I prefer compliments I know to be untrue." He looked at her for a long moment, something unreadable moving behind his grey eyes. "I asked you to dance," he said, "because I have spent the better part of this evening watching every other woman in this room perform for my benefit, and you alone have not attempted it once. I had no expectation that performing would gain me anything," Dorothy said. "I am not generally considered worth the effort." "I find that assessment entirely incorrect," he said. Before Dorothy could formulate a response to that, the Duke turned, raised his voice just enough to carry to the nearest cluster of guests, and said, with perfect composure, "I intend to call upon Miss Fenwick this week, with the purpose of seeking her hand. I wish the matter understood plainly, rather than left to speculation." The ballroom, quite audibly, gasped. "You cannot possibly be serious," Dorothy's mother said, the moment they returned home, pacing the length of the drawing-room with an energy Dorothy had rarely witnessed in her. "He announced it in front of everyone, before he had even called upon your father." "I am aware, Mother. I was standing beside him." "Why you? Of all the—" "Dorothy, I do not mean that unkindly. But Isabel was standing not 3 feet away, and Clara." "I am aware of where my sisters were standing," Dorothy said. "I do not have an explanation for you. He simply asked for the supper dance, and then he announced an intention I had not previously discussed with him at all. This is either the most fortunate accident in the history of this family," her mother said, "or a catastrophe I have not yet identified the shape of." "Possibly both," Dorothy said, which seemed increasingly to be her honest assessment of most things lately. Her sisters found her in the bedroom she shared with Sophia, all 3 of them arriving within minutes of each other with the particular urgency of women who could not possibly wait until morning. "You must tell us everything," Isabel said, settling onto the end of the bed without invitation. "Every word. I've replayed the entire evening in my head, and I still cannot account for it." "There is very little to tell," Dorothy said. "He asked me to dance. We spoke. He announced his intentions before I had entirely finished processing the dance itself." "But why you?" Clara asked, not unkindly, though the question landed with its own particular weight regardless. "I do not mean to be cruel, Dorothy. Truly I do not. I'm only trying to understand." "I have been asking myself the same question," Dorothy admitted. "I do not have a satisfying answer. He said I did not perform for him the way everyone else in the room appeared to be performing. I'm not certain that explains an entire proposal, but it appears to have been sufficient for him." "I have never once thought of you as plain," Sophia said quietly from her side of the room. "I have thought of you as quiet. There is a difference, though I do not believe anyone outside this family has ever bothered to notice it." Dorothy looked at her sister, oddly moved. "You have never said that before." "I did not think it needed saying," Sophia said. "I'm glad someone else finally noticed without my having to point it out." The Duke called 3 days later, precisely as promised, and Dorothy received him in the modest drawing-room with her mother hovering near the doorway, under the transparent pretense of arranging flowers. "I imagine you have questions," he said. "Several," Dorothy said, the foremost being why. "You corrected me about the orchestra without being asked," he said. "Twice, in fact, over the course of the evening, to 2 different people, neither of whom you knew were reporting back to me." "I did not realize I was being observed." "That is precisely why it mattered," he said. Everyone in that room was performing for an audience they knew was watching. You were not performing at all. You were simply being accurate, regardless of who heard it. That seems like a remarkably small foundation for a proposal, Your Grace. It is not the only foundation, he said, but it is the one that made me cross the room instead of remaining where I was comfortable. He paused. My name is Marcus, if you would prefer to use it. I find Your Grace rather formal for a man asking to court you. I've known you for one dance and a single conversation, Dorothy said. I'm not entirely certain what I am meant to call you. Whatever feels honest, he said. I've found that is the only standard I'm interested in, going forward. The courtship that followed was, by Dorothy's own private estimation, considerably stranger than anything her sisters had experienced. You have brought me a book on agricultural reform, she observed 3 weeks later, examining the volume he had presented her with the same gravity most suitors reserved for flowers. You mentioned at supper that you found the tenant farming discussion more interesting than the dessert course, Marcus said. I assumed you might appreciate the subject explored further. Most men bring flowers. Most men have not noticed what actually interests you, he said. I am attempting to correct that deficiency in myself. Dorothy turned the book over in her hands, oddly moved by it in a way she had not expected to be moved by anything quite this practical. My sisters think you have lost your senses, she said. Your sisters are entitled to their opinion. Isabel in particular finds it bewildering. She is, by every reasonable measure, more beautiful than I am, and she cannot understand why that did not settle the matter for you. Beauty settles very little, Marcus said. I have been surrounded by beautiful, agreeable women my entire adult life, all of them perfectly arranged and entirely indistinguishable from one another by the end of an evening. You told me the very first time we spoke that you preferred honesty to flattery. I have not stopped thinking about that since. They walked the grounds at Ravensworth the following week, far enough from the house that propriety required only a maid trailing at a discreet distance, close enough to the lake that Dorothy could watch the swans drift past while she considered her next question. Why have you never married before now? She asked. You are 32. I imagine half the mothers in England have attempted to arrange something. They have, Marcus agreed. I declined every introduction for the better part of a decade. I told myself it was because none of them suited, which was true, though not for the reasons I gave at the time. What was the real reason? He considered the question with the same seriousness he gave most things. My father's marriage to my mother was a transaction conducted with great civility and no warmth whatsoever. I watched them for 20 years and concluded that affection was simply not available to people in my position. I built an entire life around that conclusion, rather than test it. And now I've met a woman who corrected my orchestra without being asked, he said, and I find the conclusion considerably less convincing than it once was. Dorothy was quiet for a moment, watching the swans. I have built my own conclusions, she admitted, that I would always be the practical sister, useful perhaps, reliable, never the one anyone crossed a room for. I crossed an entire ballroom for you, Marcus said. You did, Dorothy said. I am still rather astonished by it, if I am honest. You are always honest, he said. It is the thing I find I cannot do without, now that I have had it. You read a great deal, Marcus observed. finding her in his library one wet afternoon, a volume of Wollstonecraft open on her lap. "I've always read more than was considered useful for a young woman with no fortune to recommend her," Dorothy said. "My mother despaired of it. She believed I would have been better served learning to embroider more skillfully and complain less about the content of sermons." "I find I disagree with your mother rather frequently." "You are not required to flatter her opinions simply because you are courting her daughter." "I am not flattering anyone," he said, settling into the chair across from her. "I've read that particular volume myself. I find your underlined passages considerably more interesting than my own observations were." Dorothy looked at the book, faintly embarrassed. "I did not realize you had noticed the markings." "I notice everything you do," he said simply. "It has become rather an unavoidable habit." He has rearranged his entire study to accommodate her visits, his sister, Lady Augusta, informed their mother, the Dowager Duchess, over tea, with the particular relish of someone who had been waiting years for her brother to do anything interesting. He has had the second sitting room repainted because Miss Fenwick mentioned in passing that she found the previous shade of green oppressive. "That seems an excessive response to a passing comment," the Dowager said. "That is precisely my point, Mother. My brother has never once acted on a passing comment from anyone in his entire life. He has built an entire reputation on remaining unmoved." Augusta leaned forward. "He is entirely moved now, and he does not appear to know what to do with the sensation, which I find delightful to observe." Lady Beatrice Sumner arrived at the Hartwell garden party with the settled confidence of a woman who had, until 3 weeks prior, considered her own engagement to the Duke of Ravensworth a near certainty. "Miss Fenwick," she said, finding Dorothy near the rose beds with a smile that carried considerably more edge than warmth. "How interesting to see you here, on Marcus's arm. I confess I did not see this particular development coming." "Lady Beatrice," Dorothy said evenly, "I've known him for years, you understand. Our families have always assumed the match was simply a matter of time." She studied Dorothy with deliberate, unhurried assessment. "I do hope you understand what you have stepped into. He has very specific expectations of a duchess. Connections, Polish, a presence that commands a room rather than disappears into its corners." Her smile sharpened. "I should hate for you to discover, too late, that you were merely a passing curiosity before he returned to sense." Dorothy kept her composure with considerable effort. "I am aware that I am not what people expected, Lady Beatrice." "No," Beatrice agreed pleasantly. "I imagine you are aware of that every single day." She departed with a final, glittering smile, and Dorothy stood very still among the roses, breathing carefully, until Marcus appeared at her side moments later, his expression already grim. "Beatrice has been talking to you." "She came to offer her observations," Dorothy said. "I can imagine precisely what form those took." He turned to face her fully. "Dorothy, whatever she said to you—" "She's not entirely wrong," Dorothy said quietly. "I am not what anyone expected. I've spent my whole life being the sister no one looked at twice." "I have looked at you considerably more than twice," Marcus said. "I have looked at almost nothing else since the night of the ball." Beatrice was correct about one thing only. "I did once consider that our family's expectations might eventually become an engagement." I have known for 3 weeks now that I could not do it, because she has never once told me an uncomfortable truth in the entire time I have known her, and you have done little else since we met. Lady Beatrice found a second opportunity at the theatre the following week, settling into the seat beside Dorothy during the interval with the easy confidence of someone who believed the seat was rightfully hers, regardless of who currently occupied it. "Still here, Miss Fenwick," she said pleasantly. "How persistent of you." "I find persistence is generally rewarded," Dorothy said. "Sometimes." Beatrice's smile did not waver. "Though I do wonder whether you have considered what happens once the novelty wears thin. Men of Marcus's position are fascinated by something unusual for a season. It rarely lasts beyond that. I should know. I spent rather a long time learning that particular lesson myself before deciding my own prospects required less patience and more practicality." "I am not aware that I am a novelty," Dorothy said. "I am aware that I am the only person who has told him his orchestra was flat." "How charming," Beatrice said, "to build an entire courtship on a single musical complaint." "It has worked rather well so far," Dorothy said. Across the box, Marcus returned from greeting an acquaintance, and his gaze found Dorothy before it registered Beatrice's presence at all. Something in his expression cooled instantly, and he crossed the box to stand beside Dorothy's chair rather than take his own seat. "Beatrice," he said, "I did not realize you required an escort to find your own box." "I wish to greet Miss Fenwick," Beatrice said. "We were having such an interesting conversation about novelty." "I am sure you were," Marcus said, and the warning beneath the words was unmistakable. Beatrice rose, gathering her shawl with practiced grace. "I shall leave you both to the second act then." She paused at Dorothy's shoulder. "Do take care, Miss Fenwick. It is a long way to fall from being noticed to being forgotten." She departed before either of them could answer, and Marcus sat down in the chair she had vacated, closer to Dorothy than the seating strictly required. "Ignore her," he said quietly. "I am trying," Dorothy said. "Try harder," he said, and something in the dryness of it made her laugh despite herself, and the tightness in her chest eased just slightly for the remainder of the evening. "You have gone very quiet since the garden party," Dorothy's mother observed that evening, setting down her needlework with a particular attentiveness she reserved for matters she considered genuinely important. "Lady Beatrice said some things," Dorothy admitted. "I have been turning them over." "What sort of things?" "That I am not what a duchess is meant to be. That I will not hold his interest once the novelty fades." Dorothy stared at her own hands. "She is not entirely wrong, Mother. I've spent my whole life being the practical one, the honest one, never the one anyone fought to keep." Her mother was quiet for a long moment. "I have not always known how to speak to you, Dorothy," she said finally. "I confess I spent years more occupied with your sister's prospects than with yours, because theirs seemed more urgent, and that was unkind of me, even if I did not intend it as unkindness." She reached over and took Dorothy's hand. "But I have watched that man cross a room for you, repaint a room for you, abandon a decade of careful reserve for you. Whatever Lady Beatrice believes about novelty, I have never once seen the Duke of Ravensworth behave like a man chasing something temporary." "You truly believe that?" "I've raised 4 daughters," her mother said. I know the difference between infatuation and the real thing, even if I have not always known how to nurture it in the right direction. Go to him, Dorothy. Whatever doubt Beatrice planted, do not let it grow simply because it found fertile, frightened soil. She found him in the library 2 nights later, a single lamp burning low, his correspondence entirely abandoned. "I have been thinking about what Beatrice said," Dorothy admitted, settling into the chair across from him. "So have I." He closed the ledger he had not been reading. "I should tell you something, and I find I do not know how to do it without sounding more sentimental than I generally allow myself to be. You may attempt it regardless. My father told me, when I was young, that a duke's marriage was a matter of strategy, not affection," he said. "Connections, fortune, presentation." I believed him for years, because believing him was easier than wanting something he had told me was foolish to want. Then a woman corrected my orchestra at my own ball and called the supper merely adequate, and I discovered I had been wrong about what I was permitted to want at all. Dorothy's breath caught. "I love you," he said plainly, the way he said most things. "Not despite being overlooked your whole life, because of how you carried it, without bitterness, without performance, simply telling the truth in rooms that never once rewarded you for it. I do not want a wife who performs for a room. I want the one person who has never once tried. I have spent my entire life believing I would always be the sister standing slightly behind the others," Dorothy said, her eyes bright. "Useful for honesty, perhaps. Never chosen first for anything." "I am choosing you first," Marcus said. "Not despite my own family's expectations. Against every single one of them, because none of those expectations ever once accounted for what I actually wanted, until you stood in my ballroom and told me my orchestra was flat. That is not a very romantic foundation for a proposal," Dorothy said, though her voice had gone unsteady. "I am not a particularly romantic man," he said. "I am a man entirely, specifically in love with you, which I am told is a different thing, though it feels remarkably similar from where I am sitting." "Yes," Dorothy said. "Yes, what?" "Yes to all of it. The orchestra, the agricultural reform book, Beatrice's warnings, every bit of it." He crossed the small distance between them and kissed her with a gentleness that undid every assumption she had carried about her own unremarkable place in the world, and outside the library windows, the evening settled quietly over Ravensworth House. They married in late spring, the wedding considerably grander than Dorothy had ever imagined for herself, attended by every member of the county who had once called her plain and now claimed, with remarkable consistency, to have always seen something special in her. Lady Beatrice Sumner sent a card of cool congratulation and married a viscount in Surrey by the following winter, and was rarely mentioned at Ravensworth House again. 2 years later, the library at Ravensworth House holds, on a quiet spring afternoon, a fire unnecessary in the mild weather but lit anyway because Dorothy has always preferred the sound of it, and considerably more noise than either of them anticipated when they married. "Mamma, the orchestra is flat again," says their daughter Beatrice, named with considerable irony Dorothy still finds delightful after no one in particular, 3 years old and already possessed of her mother's exacting ear, though there is, in fact, no orchestra currently present in the room at all. "Is it?" Dorothy says, examining her daughter with affectionate seriousness. "Which instrument precisely?" All of them, the child declares, with the absolute confidence of someone who has never once doubted her own assessment. She gets that from you, Marcus says, not looking up from his correspondence. She gets the confidence from you, Dorothy says. I spent 24 years being told I was unremarkable. I did not develop confidence until considerably later. You are never unremarkable, he says. You are simply standing in rooms full of people who had not yet learned how to look properly. Dorothy's sister, Sophia, arrives shortly after, married now herself to a perfectly amiable baronet, and settles into her usual chair with the easy familiarity of someone who is visited often enough to no longer require announcement. Mother still cannot quite believe it, Sophia says. She tells the story differently every time. Sometimes she claims she always knew. Sometimes she admits she nearly fainted in the carriage home. Both versions are likely true, Dorothy says. She is permitted to hold them simultaneously. Isabel still asks me every time I see her whether I have discovered the secret, Sophia adds, as though there were some trick to it. Some particular phrase you must have said that night that none of us overheard. There was no trick, Dorothy says. I simply told him the orchestra was flat. That cannot possibly be the entire explanation. It is the entire explanation, Marcus says, finally looking up from his correspondence. I have told your family this on several occasions. No one believes me. I find that rather telling about how little credit honesty is generally given. You have become rather generous in your old age, Sophia says to Dorothy, ignoring her brother-in-law entirely, which Dorothy has come to recognize as Sophia's particular way of demonstrating affection toward him. I am 26, Dorothy says. I am hardly elderly. You are generous regardless, Sophia says, and reaches for little Beatrice, who climbs into her aunt's lap with the same easy confidence she brings to all her musical criticisms. Marcus crosses the room and sits beside Dorothy, taking her hand the way he has every evening for 2 years, and watches his daughter critique an absent orchestra with ferocious conviction, and his wife's sister laughing at something only she finds funny, and his wife herself beside him exactly where he has wanted her since the night he crossed a crowded ballroom and asked the one woman no one else had thought to ask. Do you remember, he says, that they called you the plainest girl in the county? I remember, Dorothy says. I have never once understood it, he says. I do not believe I ever will. You stood up at your own ball, Dorothy says, and walked past every beauty in the room to ask for my hand instead. I've stopped trying to make sense of it. I've simply decided to be grateful for it. He kisses her temple, and the fire burns on regardless of the mild spring weather. And the library that once belonged to a duke alone now holds instead an entire small and very loved family, exactly where neither of them expected to be, and precisely where both of them intend to stay. The end. Dear listener, perhaps you have spent a lifetime being told in ways large and small that you were the overlooked one, the sister who was not the prettiest, the friend who was not the most charming, the woman who learned, somewhere along the way, that being honest and being chosen rarely happened in the same room. So you settled quietly for being honest instead, and told yourself that was enough. Dorothy did not become remarkable the night the Duke chose her. She had been remarkable the entire time, clear-eyed, unwilling to perform, telling the truth in rooms that never once rewarded her for it. The only thing that changed was that someone finally walked across the room to notice. So many of us carry an old story about our own unremarkableness, written by people who simply were not looking closely enough. We carry it for years. We let it shape which rooms we enter, which rooms we hide ourselves in, which loves we believe ourselves entitled to receive. If you are 40 or 50, or further still, and some old version of you still believes you were the plain one, the overlooked one, the sister standing slightly behind, please hear this clearly. The people who failed to notice you were never describing the truth of you. They were simply describing the limits of their own attention. You do not need to become someone else to be chosen. You need only be found by someone willing to look properly. It happens later for some of us than others. It is no less real for the wait. Tonight, as you rest, let yourself release whatever label was handed to you, too young to argue against. Sleep well, dear friend. The right eyes are not finished looking for you yet. With love from all of us at Fables of Love. Thank you so much for staying with us until the very end of this story. If it made you laugh, cry, or believe in love all over again, we would be so grateful if you liked this video, left a comment, and subscribed to the channel. Sharing it with someone who loves historical romance means the world to us and keeps our storytelling corner alive. Another story is waiting for you at the end of this video. Click, listen, and let your heart be swept away once more. From all of us at Fables of Love, thank you for being here.